This video essay is in no way intended to trash anyone's ship. I need to preface the video with this because I'm afraid that's what it'll spark. Griselle is a ship, like every other, and I think it's valid to ship, even if it isn't my own cup of tea. What I intend to do here is an analysis of canonical text that near blatantly tells us that maybe Chris and Noelle are better off as just friends. Again, I'm not trashing the ship or anyone that ships it, as I myself am of the opinion that shipping shouldn't need to lean into canon for validity. I am the Space Gore guy, I know a thing or two about ships that'll never become canon, and there's a comforting freedom in the idea that you don't have to conform or follow what the author intended with the text. With that said, I think Toby is trying to tell us something very specific with the text. Noelle's first theme, and arguably her main theme, is called Girl Next Door. Coupling this with the fact that she's Chris's childhood friend slots her neatly into the romantic trope of the girl next door. A golden girl, someone the lead has known his whole life, someone who knows him better than anyone else, and someone he's fated by the narrative to fall in love with, even if they bicker and fight because they just know each other so well. This trope has been done again and again and again, and Deltarune is clearly invoking it pretty heavily with Noelle. She's the top student, mayor's daughter, brings her love interest lunchboxes to school and stuff. And while Susie usually takes the role of her romantic interest, in the Snowgrave route, this is really the case. The player's action seems to override anything that should have happened between Susie and Noelle in Queen's Mansion. The Ferris wheel ride never happens, Noelle stays locked in her room, and Susie refuses to speak about what happened, even though it's clear she's also in denial. She wants Noelle to wake up from this nightmare, hinting us towards her having some kind of idea of what really happened, or at least the severity of it, since it sent her into the same denial spiral as Noelle. By the end, Susie doesn't even think Noelle likes her anymore, and although Rudy is the least subtle wingman the world has ever seen, Susie doesn't catch the innuendo because she's preoccupied and doesn't see any of that flusteredness at her presence from Noelle that she usually does. So what does this mean, exactly? Other than it putting a potential wrench in the quote-unquote thesis that our actions don't matter. This has the very curious side effect of Chris slotting into the role of Noelle's romantic interest. Not just because of our deliberately romantic actions between them, but because Noelle is no longer fantasizing about Susie. She's no longer preoccupied with normal teenager crushes, and is instead thinking about Chris, thinking about fixing them. A fantasy she never had with Susie. She's fallen into the worst interpretation of a Beauty and the Beast story, where with Susie she was accepting the kindness beneath the roughness and mutual aid of each other's well-being. She's instead looking for humanity beneath the monstrous actions that can't be really forgiven. And she's doing it because she thinks she's just as bad. Don't confuse it with Stockholm Syndrome. It's trauma bonding. It's thinking you're the only person who can stop your abuser because you know them so well. If you've watched my universal mother theory, you probably heard me mention parent-adult-child ego states, even if briefly. It's a psychological model where the ego, the internal whole person, is split between three states: the child, the adult, and the parent. It has a lot of parallels to Freud's id, ego, and superego, but where it differs is in the transactional analysis, the idea that these ego states seek to always complement one another in social interactions. Let me explain with a couple examples. When Ralsei asks Chris to take the items from the spare classroom and bring them to the closet, and Chris obliges, this is the adult-adult interaction. Ralsei asks for assistance and provides instructions, and Chris, or rather the player, weighs their options and does the tasks. In contrast, when you call Toriel in Chapter 1 and Chris asks her to drive him home, Toriel responds with, "It's a 10-minute walk, I'm not getting in my car for that, just walk home." This is a child-parent interaction, where one person is acting on emotion and impulse and the other is acting in a disciplinary and authoritative manner. This is a healthy interaction, but it doesn't always have to be, and parent states and child states aren't reserved for literally just parents and literally just children. As another example, Toriel and Sansa's interaction starts as a classic adult-adult interaction based on information and cooperation, but soon it devolves into a playful child-child interaction. This is no longer about exchanging information, it's about having fun. This is also healthy, but what's fascinating to me is what happens when Asgore enters the scene. He's matching the child ego state, everything is in harmony, but Toriel is the one who disrupts that, deliberately switching to the adult ego state, literally killing the vibe. This causes a disbalance in the ego states, so Asgore adapts and also responds in the adult states. On a social level, I'm not getting into the weeds of the differences between social profile and psychological profile of ego states, mostly because it's irrelevant to today's discussion, but I want you to keep that instinct to maintain ego balance in mind. If one person talks as an adult, you're likely to match with another adult. If one person talks as a parent, you're either going to talk as another parent, or, more likely if you're younger, you're going to regress into a child state. This maintains harmony. No lines are being crossed, and exactly in crossing those lines do conflicts arise and are attempted to be resolved. If someone switches to a child-parent model while you're talking adult-adult, you're probably going to be very, very confused, and vice versa. Here's another important thing to keep in mind about ego states. The adult is the only whole one in that it's just an objective perceiver and actor in the present moment. The adult doesn't dwell on memories, it acts based on current given information, while the child and parent states influence it based on past experiences. Our parent state is most likely going to be inherited from one or both of our parents wholesale, the critical parent or the nurturing parent. The way you were raised is your moral instinct and likely how you'll raise others, unless you actively try to do the opposite. While the child is... Well, the thing about the child state is there's a sort of default, one we're all born with, one that we all have universally. The free child. This is the part of you that's creative, lacks inhibition, seeks things that make it happy, and wants nothing but to have a good time for a long time. The free child is, ironically, where most romantic and sexual instincts also come from. Tapping into that free spirit is kind of necessary for authentic and fulfilling expressions of self, especially in the context of interpersonal relationships. But the sad thing is, a lot of us lose that connection to the free child. The adapted child is the instinct we develop in face of authority. The adapted child is someone obedient and willing to take directions for just about anything. Being polite, following social norms, holding the door for someone, this is the adapted child. Someone who respects rules because they're rules, not because of some objective advantage that this action gives. The problem is, the adapted child can often be abused by parental figures or systems of power that seek to keep people unquestioning and obedient. In response to repeated threats to the authentic self by a power trying to abuse an adapted child state, what usually ends up forming instead is a rebellious child, one that seeks to dismiss, undermine, and generally shit all over those rules and expectations. Not as a dismantling of the system, mind you, but as a mindless rebellion against something that they perceive as trying to screw them over. The rebellious child can be very useful, it needs to be nurtured to an extent, but it's also possible for it to go too far and not really know the limits of what's really a threat and what isn't. Deltarune, as a story, is, I think, partly about the main characters reconnecting with the free child within each of them. Castletown is a haven of fun and friends and limitless potential. The Dark Worlds help them overcome their mental blockades, the ones that are stopping them from being and expressing their authentic selves, and there's a huge motif of freedom and childhood nostalgia and how they're both at odds with one another, but also intrinsically connected to one another. A simple time where you felt free, but trying to reach or recreate that past will inevitably trap you and you'll wind up chained to it, unable to find something better. So, what does any of this have to do with the Snowgrave route? As I've made it pretty clear, I think Noelle is stuck in her adapted child state for most of Deltarune Chapter 2. She does as she's told, she can't stand up to Queen, and the final moment of confrontation revolves around her telling off Queen like a textbook rebellious child. "I'll never be happy" is not something a free child would say, but this is still huge progress for her. I don't think this needs to be stated, but just in case, Noelle is dealing with a very, very strict parent in the form of her mother. Rudy says she's hard on Noelle, but seeing how genuinely sad she is at being alone with her and how scared she gets at the mere mention of her, I think it's clear Noelle's mother is more than just strict. The biggest hint we have towards this is that Noelle's mother keeps the AC on full blast at all times. Haha, funny reindeer joke. But then you have the anecdote that Noelle sometimes just doesn't function when faced with the cold. She freezes up at the physical sensation because of the psychological association she makes with her mother. Metaphorical and literal coldness that Noelle is both numb to, but also terrified by. Funny then that her most powerful spell is an ice spell. She makes others freeze with the coldness she inherited from her mother. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'd like to talk about Rudy for a moment. Most of the time when discussing Noelle and her mother, Rudy's words are often cited, but no one quite examines what his role in the household actually is. At least not that I've seen it. He's a mediator. He acts as a kind of equalizing force between his daughter and wife, and this may seem like a good thing, but he can't always be there. Even when he can, what he's doing is putting a band-aid on a larger problem. He's enabling bad behavior because he's scared to address the root issue, similar to how he downplays the severity of his illness and dismisses it as just tests and nothing a holiday can't handle. Am I implying Rudy is scared of his wife? Yes, I am. A good contrast is Toriel and Asgore, aptly enough. Even when she wants nothing to do with him, Toriel is at no point afraid of him, and it shows. She's able to dismiss him, shut him down, and shut him out. But even without Mrs. Holiday present, her influence taints nearly every interaction Rudy and Noelle have. Noelle fears her mother, Noelle fears her dad's illness, and in turn, Rudy puts on a brave face because he wants to protect his daughter. He doesn't understand, or maybe doesn't want to acknowledge, that his current actions are causing her more pain. Speaking of Toriel and Asgore, though, in my other videos I've made it pretty clear that I think their divorce had a very palpable negative effect on Chris. I don't mean that in a divorce leads kids to the worst places way, just in that Chris is an adopted child with abandonment issues and now lives with just one family member that's overly lenient with their symptoms of depression. For Chris specifically, it kind of seems like they'd thrive best in a household with two parents and their brother still present, but life isn't always perfect and they have to learn to accept their situation for what it is. Which is exactly what I speculate Chapter 3 will be about. Or maybe they won't accept it. A lot of the time, when we discuss the player as an influence on Deltarune, we almost frame it as a parasite, some outsider meddling with something they shouldn't be and messing up Chris's life in the process. But I think that can't be further from the truth. This world, this game, exists for us. The very medium of video game cannot exist without a player entity, and we are part of this narrative, and the role we play is that of fate. We aren't a person to these characters. We have no voice unless Chris is prompted to speak or wants to say something. We make that choice for them not as a puppeteer, but as an embodiment of the inevitable, what Chris was always going to do, because Deltarune isn't concerned with timelines. It makes no mention of them, and the choices all lead to the general same outcome. This is predeterminism. This is the law of this world dictating that Chris can't go back and undo what they've done, but we can, because we are the hand of fate. We are the one that decides exactly how the prophecy goes. This also means, to me, that we aren't working against Chris the way Chris is working against us. It's clear they have a much more complicated relationship with the player than we might assume, as they always take the soul back. They need it. They need purpose. They need direction. And Chris's lack of action before we show up kind of shows that. It's not that they have things they'd rather be doing, it's that they don't know what to do without us. We aren't literally Chris, but we influence Chris and the way they see the world, the things they say to their friends, who they choose to take with them, because without us, they can't make those choices themselves. It's a kind of sad consequence of depression, actually. A lot of our small, daily choices are fueled by emotion. What to wear, what to eat for breakfast, which song to play in the background. We make them instinctually, without thinking, to give them a lot of thought is to waste energy that we can use on other things. But those instincts are intrinsically fueled by emotion, which depression nulls. You don't feel happy, you don't feel sad, you don't feel anything. You're numb to yourself and your surroundings. That's why it can be difficult to decide what to wear, when to get up, what to eat, so sometimes it's easier if you just don't. It's so much energy to spend on such inconsequential choices when you're already so tired all the time. I think this is kind of the point of Chris's arc. I don't think they have clinical depression, at least not yet. I think they're going through a really rough phase in their life and have become depressed, but Deltarune shows their journey towards reclaiming themselves and what they want. In Chapter 1, they make the small but impactful choice to go eat pie on their own. In Chapter 2, they make the bigger and difficult to justify choice of forcing Susie to stay and opening a fountain. Over time, I believe Chris will stabilize and their independence from us will grow, and maybe at a certain point we won't be given any choices anymore. It'll just be Chris, following their real heart, just the way we taught them to. But that way doesn't have to be a good one. What if Chris starts to think it's good to beat people up, just because it's easier? What if Chris acts sarcastic and cold towards Ralsei when he's trying to open up? What if they start to think that their friends are better off without them? What if they bond with Noelle by making sure she can't leave them like everyone else does? Remember how I said our parent ego state is often inherited from our parents? Do you also remember how Chris has trouble letting go of the past and has abandonment issues? I'd also like you to keep in mind that Chris isn't a doormat like Asgore is. They're snarky and a prankster and know which buttons to push to get people to act the way they want them to. They were able to make their bully leave in a huff without hurting them. They were able to pull a prank on the player so severe 40% of the fandom was convinced they were literally Kara for a while. And all this to say, I think the Snowgrave route is an exploration of a what-if scenario of Chris and Noelle acting out the worst scenarios their parents taught them while acting on their own personal worst traits and impulses. Let's examine one room in the Snowgrave route specifically, the Ferris wheel poster room. This place has the most explicit reference to this kind of reading of the route, in my opinion. Firstly, we start with Noelle being in awe of the Ferris wheel, momentarily reminiscing about the one from the town's fair, part of her childhood and present day, before immediately wondering if Susie would like to go with her, moving towards the future. She dismisses the thought jokingly, and we get the opportunity to speak. Chris wants to say something. On a normal route, you'd probably humor Noelle to an extent, but it's crucial to the Snowgrave route that you say that Chris will take her instead. Again, keep in mind we aren't acting against Chris, we're acting as a hand of fate that guides them. Noelle basically brushes this off. She's a little surprised, but clearly doesn't think much of it, other than Chris trying to prank her again, ending with a no thank you. Insisting on it, in our reading, Chris not letting Noelle move on from their shared past because of their own issues, causes Noelle to be confused, before caving and agreeing to go with Chris so they can make up for before. She's trying to look to the future, but she's stuck reminiscing and trying to make up for the past. Breaking down this interaction, it starts with the free child state in Noelle. She's imaginative, hopeful, and for a moment she lapses into adaptive, dismissing the idea that Susie will go with her. When Chris says they'll go with her, they're reframing the conversation from an adult perspective, offering a pragmatic alternative. But Noelle lapses back into a child because she, rightfully so, interprets their words as actually coming from their child state, equally as nostalgic as she was. But then Chris insists, not like a child, you gotta, but like a parent, you must. A critical parent. And Noelle instinctively caves. Her adaptive child takes over as a survival mechanism at the slightest hint of conflict. Through the player's influence, Chris becomes manipulative and demanding, and uncaring for the well-being of others, keeping everyone else at a distance except for Noelle, while Noelle drenches herself in denial as she does horrible things on someone else's behest, becoming stronger to survive. She's resilient, she's obedient. This is nothing a holiday can't handle. This is what's fascinating to me. Chris is acting as a critical parent, the opposite of what their parents are because they don't want to repeat their mistakes. They don't want to end up alone again. Meanwhile, Noelle is stuck in her adaptive child state, both as a trauma response to conflict, but also because that's exactly what her dad would do too. Adapt and allow and reinterpret aggression in order to preserve normalcy and order. She's becoming stronger because she's enduring more. She's no longer scared of people because she's developing unhealthy ways of getting rid of them if need be. She's harnessing her mother's coldness while being re-traumatized herself, and she thinks it's making her stronger because she's growing numb to it. The second important scene is with the shopkeeper, who offers them dating shoes. Noelle internally wrestles with the idea that she's known Chris for so long now and how well they know each other, but how she's not sure if she can call them a friend. She thinks this in the context of Chris coming over to her house to play, but seemingly not being interested in her specifically. How as a child she'd fantasized that their playing was a concert just for her. Again, in the Snowgrave route, it's imperative for Chris to say that they and Noelle are something more. Otherwise, the route stops then and there. Noelle, again rather normally, balks at the wording Chris chose because there's no good interpretation. She doesn't want there to be romantic subtext, but Chris is artificially inserting it. Or rather, the player is guiding them to. Some might say Chris doesn't want that either, but we don't know them well enough to say that definitively. It's down to her interpretation, how we guide them. Insisting on a romantic relationship on a girl-next-door trope because Noelle's always been there for them makes sense for Chris because they don't want to lose anyone else. It's just what you're supposed to do with a childhood friend, right? And their other friends don't need them, and they can make Noelle need them. She does need them. Without Chris, she wouldn't have gone this far, right? And I'd like to address the fact that the player can read Noelle's thoughts, essentially. It's more explicit in later scenes, but I think this one may provide context for how this doesn't break the toxic relationship reading of the route. Because if Chris and Noelle really do know each other as well as we know them to, it makes sense if Noelle sometimes felt like Chris was reading her mind because of how well they can tell what she's thinking while are saying it explicitly. In Deltarune, there's a paranormal explanation, but metatextually, we can still read it into a real-world situation. Often, abusers will know exactly what to do, exactly what buttons to push, in order to get the reaction they want from their victims, saying the things they withheld from their victim, what they knew the victim wanted, in order to get them to behave how they want them to in a given scenario. To give more because they want more. And that's when the shopkeeper calls them back, offering a ring. Noelle, again, dismisses it, but realizes it'll make her stronger. And indeed, there's a sort of social status afforded to married couples that non-married couples don't have. But pay attention to the wording that follows. Chris, we don't have the money for that. The way Noelle is talking sounds like a couple arguing over finances, and in the end, it's not about the money or the ring, it's about getting stronger. It's about us exerting power over Noelle and her actions, and Chris learning that pattern, realizing that if they just push her hard enough, she'll do anything. She'd even steal from them and frame it as if they're the ones who gave her a gift, because she trusts Chris. She wants this to be a concert just for her, and Chris is keeping her under control, because they don't want her to leave them behind. Some people might see this reading as far-fetched. Chris isn't an abuser in any other route, and Noelle hasn't shown romantic interest in Chris in basically any context. But that's what the role of the player is. We decide the fate that befalls these kids, and this is the in-code weird route. This isn't how it was meant to go, but it's something fate can conspire against them. Exploiting Noelle and Chris's trauma responses, we can box them into a corner where they feel like they can't rely on anyone else, and it makes them lash out as a unit. Chris as the manipulator, and Noelle as the mediator. Chris as the defender, and Noelle as the frostmancer. Chris as the mastermind, and Noelle as the party member that's getting stronger. Building the wrong kind of resilience in them both, and making them not realize that the problems are coming from inside their house. First from the ones they grew up in, and now in the one they metaphorically share. I think this is why Noelle's snow globe effect that activates later in the route looks the way it does. It's a three-pronged house. Either this is literally what the holiday house looks like, referencing where her trauma response stems from, or it's a visual representation of three places, three broken relationships that have built up to this disaster. Chris's parents, Noelle's parents, and now Chris and Noelle, together, uniting the two and repeating the worst of their mistakes. It's why Burnley so explicitly says, "my friend Noelle," when threatening Chris. It's like someone trying to stage an intervention for their friend who's in a clearly abusive relationship and suffering the consequences. It's why Noelle keeps wondering about Chris and that dream even after her leaving the dark world. Even her dad notices something's wrong, but this isn't something he can protect her from. It's his habits that rubbed off on her and led to this in the first place. Noelle wants to find out what's wrong with Chris to stop them, but she's essentially just looking for excuses to do exactly what they want her to. Exactly how she excuses their threats, exactly how she happily says, "should we look for more enemies," even if it's clearly weighing on her and making her unhappy, because Chris is helping her get stronger. And now, she's looking for Chris and looking for reasons to be around Chris, because she already anticipates that they'll find a way to her anyway. And they do. There's a bit of a trap a lot of abuse victims fall into. That "I can fix them" meme is basically the best way to sum it up. Thinking you're special enough and equipped to change your abuser for the better. People go back to bad exes because they say they've changed, because they want to make sense of how there's been so much bad and so much good at the same time. Or at least things they perceive as good. Times when they felt loved or tended to or heard in a way they saw as authentic and meaningful. And I believe that's exactly what's happening with Noelle, and I believe that's exactly what's been happening with Rudy. Again, in this reading I've slotted Chris into the role of an abuser, and while I've provided context for why they take these actions somewhat willingly at the behest of the player, I don't want it to come off as me excusing their actions. I'm not. And I don't mean it in a doing a bad route in a video game is morally reprehensible way, I'm talking purely in-universe things. I think more people have the capacity to be cruel and abusive than they realize. Not everyone can be manipulative their whole lives, but a lot of us have the capacity to develop manipulative and exploitative habits, especially if we're backed into a corner and feel like people keep using us and betraying us. These behaviors need to be addressed when they crop up, but the Snowgrave route provides a context in which Chris and Noelle are isolated, and fate itself is conspiring to turn them into the worst versions of themselves they can be. Noelle has the potential to hurt others, but you can choose not to use Ice Shock. Ever. Chris has the potential to be manipulative, but you can choose to make them act genuine instead. These are avoidable tragedies, and I think the Snowgrave route specifically is a what-if scenario explored through a fantastical framework. What if Chris and Noelle did become a couple? How would that come about if Noelle doesn't like Chris romantically? If Chris has to manipulate Noelle towards it, what else would they be willing to make her do? And how would they stay together after everything that would entail? Exactly how she excuses wait, what?